Hello.
That sounded like. Is that? Oh, this one is on.
Hello.
Here.
There we go. Okay. Hi there. My name is Amanda Kasher. I'm an independent curator. Welcome to our panel, Access, Ableism and Disability in Curatorial Practice. Just a bit of background on my work. I've just recently finished my PhD at the University of California, San Diego, and my work is at the intersection of contemporary art, curatorial practice, and disability studies. And I was very interested in organizing this panel to think about curatorial practice in museums and disability, of course, in dialogue with these, my esteemed panelists, and thank you all for joining us. So to my left, I have Francesca Rosenberg, and Francesca is the Director of Community and Access Programs in MoMA's Department of Education. Then we have Danielle Linzer, and Danielle is the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the Andy Warhol Museum. And then last but not least, we have Eliza Chandler, who is an assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson University. So all of these panelists bring much experience, and I'm looking forward to their presentations. Just in terms of structure, they'll be speaking for 15 minutes each, and then hopefully we'll have time, 20 minutes for a Q&A. And all of the panelists, you'll notice, will be instigating and demonstrating for you all various access points. So for instance, they'll all be giving audio description. And we have Francesca has actually large print copies of her talk for anyone who would like that. So raise your hand before she begins if you're interested. And we'll have hopefully some really generative conversation at the end about various access points that you can easily instigate in your own institutions. So with that, I look forward to introducing Francesca.
Okay. So my first slide is just an intro slide with an older couple looking together at a Rauschenberg painting, and it says "Visitors with Disabilities" with all of the universal symbols below it. And before I dive into my PowerPoint, I wanted to ask some questions of the audience. So I'd like you to raise your hand if you or someone you know has had a temporary disability. Maybe you've had crutches or worn a cast, used a wheelchair. Okay, now keep your hand raised, and you can raise your other hand if you know someone who has trouble walking or climbing stairs. Okay. If you prefer large print or know someone who does, you can raise your foot if you have used up both hands. Has hearing loss, knows someone with Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. Okay, so raise your hands even higher, please, and now look around the room. Okay, now you can put your hands down. Thank you. So the disability community touches us all. It's the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. It affects us, people we know, and by extension, our visitors. According to the US Census Bureau, 20% of the US population reports some level of disability. That's 1 in 5 people when you take into account all those people who don't self-identify. The statistic exceeds 80 million people, or 32% of the population, and that's 1 billion people all over the world. People with disabilities are part of MoMA's general public, and they're part of your general public. Thank you. This slide shows an individual who is navigating the museum using a wheelchair. And while many of our museums have programs specifically for people with disabilities, the majority of people with disabilities visit museums independently, outside of an education program. on their own or more likely with family or friends. So MoMA has exhibitions that should be accessible, as accessible as possible to the independent visitor. Sometimes you can tell that a person has a disability, and it's really virtually impossible to go to MoMA and not see someone who is using some sort of assistive device, whether it's a wheelchair or a walker or a cane. But many people with disabilities don't use assistive equipment. They have invisible disabilities, such as a brain injury or a learning disability or epilepsy, just to name a few. So the bottom line is that everyone with a disability should be seen as an individual with varying needs, as well as abilities and attributes. Thank you. As public institutions, we are legally obligated to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we should be going above and beyond, embedding a philosophy of accessibility and inclusivity in all of our operations. Yeah, the next slide. The good news is that accommodations for people with disabilities better serve everyone. Next slide. Thank you. So this slide shows a baby stroller trying to make its way up a flight of stairs. And the idea is that, for instance, when you have a ramp, not only does it serve people who use wheelchairs, but it also serves a caregiver pushing an infant in a stroller. And the next slide shows a woman getting very close up to a work of art and to the label. Because the label is such a small font, she's having trouble reading it. And a clear, large font on a high contrast background is not just for visitors with disabilities. It's easier for everyone to read, people over 40, as well as international visitors who benefit from the written word. Thank you. And going beyond ADA compliance is not only the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. The 54 million Americans with disabilities represent the fastest growing market segment in the country. It's also the third largest. According to the US Census Bureau, people with disabilities in the US, along with their families, friends, and associates, represent a $1 trillion market segment. The discretionary spending of people with disabilities amounts to $220 billion, and new market opportunities often emerge from the consideration of the needs of people with disabilities. And finally, it's a team effort. Access is not the sole purview of one department. Everyone needs to be involved on some level. Frontline staff, curators, designers, trustees, artists, and so on.
A title, MoMA.
Here's a video. So before you go back, I'll just set it up, which is to say that this is a video. You'll notice in the video there are captions, and there's verbal description. So it's describing what you see for someone who may have low vision. And the video was created by a team of people at MoMA. We wanted the voice of people with disabilities to come through our trainings. We do a great deal of in-house training with staff from across the museum. And so we interviewed 7 people with disabilities, and here's what they said. You'll also see our director and our COO.
A title, MoMA, at the museum, our commitment to accessibility. The following individuals comment on accessibility at the museum. MoMA Director Glenn Lowry, MoMA COO, James Gara. MoMA visitor Ellen Rubin. Ellen is blind. MoMA visitor Aaron Phillip. Aaron has cerebral palsy. MoMA visitor Ruth Bernstein. Ruth is hard of hearing. MoMA visitor Karen Kaysen. Karen has albinism. MoMA visitor Jason Kingsley. Jason has Down syndrome. Staff members interact with visitors with disabilities in the museum's galleries. They guide a visitor in a wheelchair up a ramp, provide an ASL interpreter, demonstrate an audio guide transcript on a handheld device, distribute a large print brochure and a Braille museum guide, and facilitate a touch tour of sculptures. A title, Our Commitment to Accessibility. MoMA Director Glenn Lowry.
I think it's essential that the Museum of Modern Art be a leader in responding to communities with disabilities for a very simple reason. We believe in the power of art, we believe in the significance of the artists that we represent, and we believe in the importance of the audience that visits our museum. And when you put all of that together, you want the greatest possible number of people to enjoy the power of the art that's on display here, and that means addressing the needs of everybody who comes to the museum.
When somebody says, oh yeah, if you go up to the second floor and look at such and such, we have sculptures that you can touch if you use these gloves.
Ellen.
That's really welcoming.
Do you know how you see something in a book
Aaron.
and how good it is to see? Imagine how it is to see it in a museum.
Aaron
Wow.
gazes at the Starry Night painting.
You could actually see the brushstrokes and everything. This is so pretty.
Over the years, and especially in the last couple of decades, we've really tried to think of the institution as all-embracing.
I'm hard of hearing. Does the audio guide have a transcript?
It does. Let me show you how it works.
Ruth.
I'm very happy in museum environments. I love to see the things that people can do, the old paintings, the new work.
Between making it a priority within the institution, incorporating some of the latest technology, these are just the beginnings of what
COO James Gara. Karen visits the information desk.
Do you happen to have a large print brochure? Yes, we do. Oh, thank you very much. I tend to remember what was described to me in a painting, but I will never forget how a Monet was described to me or a Kandinsky was described to me. It's just, I remember art.
My grandfather taught me a whole lot of artists.
Jason.
Bosch, Monet, Mona Lisa. I love museums.
people come for a variety of reasons. Part of it could be very much community,
James.
meeting like-minded people.
I think that it's really important
Ellen.
for us to be part of the community and to be part of the cultural life. And that really makes the art important to me.
Karen and Glenn.
This was the first place I came to for a touch tour.
I think the most important thing about the Museum of Modern Art is the way in which it can bring art and people together. And so the visitor experience is the essential aspect of what we think about when we think about how people will enjoy this museum. And of course, accessibility is essential to the visitor experience. It's at the heart of what we do here at the museum.
The world is supposed to be an equal place, so why not make it equal for us too?
Aaron.
So that we can stop dreaming and live it.
Credits. Accessible programs are made possible by our generous donors. MoMA.org/learn/credits. MoMA.
So that video is a short version of a 26-minute video that's actually available on our website. As I mentioned, we use it internally for staff training, for disability equality training, but we're very happy to share it. I think that's all for me.
All right, thank you. It is an honor to be here with all of you today. My current title is, oh wait, let me see if I can go to, yes. So I am the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But for the last 8 years, I've been there less than a year, I was at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and I was very lucky to call Francesca a dear colleague. I was the Director of Access and Community Programs at the Whitney through our transition into the new building downtown. And so I'm gonna share a couple of kind of case studies today, just examples of projects or initiatives, both at the Whitney and the Warhol, that highlight how kind of putting some of these principles into practice and really starting to shift our conception of individuals with disabilities as the other, as an audience that we're not quite sure how to welcome and serve, but rather as kind of essential members of our communities in museums and as co-creators of their own experiences. So I'm going to share a quote about inclusive environments. And I apologize for having to turn, but my eyes aren't quite good enough to read that, and I didn't bring my notes. So, disability is not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. Overcoming the difficulties faced by people with disabilities requires interventions to remove environmental and social barriers. So, that's a quote from the World Health Organization, and it's accompanied by an image of two individuals who are blind or have low vision, who are exploring a work of art in the Whitney's collection, the Walk, Don't Walk sculpture by George Siegel, through touch, right? So as Francesca described, wearing gloves and actually feeling the surface and the features of the piece. But I'm somebody who firmly believes this, that disability is essentially something that exists at the intersection between a body and an environment, and that we as cultural practitioners have an opportunity, and I would say an obligation, to try to create both spaces and experiences that are enabling for our public, that are inclusive as to the greatest degree possible, and that anticipate a very diverse user base. So Francesca outlined many of the ways that they do that at the moment. Those really are a lot of best practices. Those videos are incredible resources. We also talked already about the notion that disability is really, I would argue, a defining part. Functional limitation is a defining part of what it means to be a human being. And it is something that we will all experience at some point in our lives. And I would argue that we have a spectrum of abilities that shift and change throughout our lifetimes. And so there's a small graph on the screen, or if I turn around, a rather large graph, which is from the 2005 American Community Survey, and it shows the percentage or the prevalence of disability. And again, this is disability as determined in these big kind of census-style categories as a major life limitation. But for people ages 5 to 15, the prevalence is only about 6.5% would identify as having a disability. Between 16 and 64 years of age, so what we consider, kind of broadly adulthood, it's about 12.1%. And then once we get up over the age of 65, 65% of us will identify as having a disability or a functional limitation. And to Francesca's point, the percentage is actually far greater than this, because as our abilities shift and change with time, we often don't consider ourselves to have changed. So while I might opt to use an assistive listening device, or I might prefer and feel more comfortable with large print materials, if you ask me to raise my hand if I have a disability, I might not do so. But so, again, it's good for business, it is part of our society, it is part of our communities. So I'm going to tell a little story from my time at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And this is a slide showing the beautiful new building at 99 Gansevoort Street, which opened to the public in May of 2015. We're looking at the east facade, which is a kind of stepped back series of terraces and glass walls gazing out towards the Highline Park, which is just truncated in this image. It's a sort of dusky evening view, so you can see really the light flooding and pouring out of the galleries and into those public spaces. So we did, at the Whitney, develop a number of accessible programs. Some were very similar to programs you see at other institutions. There's an image here of a very large group verbal description tour in our galleries, so people who are blind or have low vision seated on stools, and there's an educator talking about a very large portrait fill by the artist Chuck Close. So I'm going to talk quickly about a little project that we did at the Whitney. This is called the Vlog Project. And it's one that was interesting because it started out as a little kind of experimental accessibility initiative and really blossomed into something larger and shifted the way that we do our work in departments across the museum. So The image here is a little, very kind of bare bones film shoot where we have, a single light stand, a DSLR camera, and a couple of individuals standing in our galleries making, it's kind of a DIY looking video. So we, like other museums here in New York, back in 2006 at the Whitney, we started to initiate a program that was called Whitney Signs. And these were tours in American Sign Language by deaf native signers rather than through interpreters. Right, so native signers were the experts, were authoring the content and the interpretation of the works, and these were really popular tours. There are images here on the slide. There's actually 5 images, little snapshots from one of these Whitney Signs tours back at the Breuer Building, and you can see a very crowded, large group of people in the galleries. The educator who is signing is kind of addressing, she's actually standing up on a little platform so that she can be seen better in the galleries by this kind of crowded group. There's also a small inset picture of an individual receiving tactile interpretation, somebody who's deafblind, and other members of the group kind of participating in conversation in sign language. So this was an incredibly popular program and successful, but we really only offered it once, maybe twice a month. And so if you were an individual who was deaf, if you were somebody who used American Sign Language, friends and family members, this was a wonderful offering, but it was very slim, right? And as Francesca pointed out, many people are trying to visit museums independently. If you're coming from out of town, you don't have a lot of control over when you visit. So we looked at how the deaf community was communicating and how they were building community over great distances, and they were really embracing digital video and social media as tools for connection. And so we thought, okay, well, how about we do that as a museum? How about we start to open up what's happening inside the walls of the museum using these same tools that the community has embraced? We co-create some films about modern and contemporary art and what goes on inside the museum, and then we share them and see what happens. And so this was really an experimental project. We have here a couple more images from starting to film. And so you have that same presenter, a woman named Christine Sun Kim, who started giving tours at the Whitney back when she was a grad student at SVA and is now a world-renowned artist flying around giving TED Talks in American Sign Language. And I think she has a show in Amsterdam right now and is just a superstar. So here we are filming her in our galleries and essentially taking the tour she might lead and condensing it and making a little short video that we were going to put on our website. And then you can see an image, a kind of screenshot of what that looked like when we first launched the project on whitney.org. I'm going to share one of the very first videos we made as this project. You will notice that it is silent. So I will give you a moment to watch it, and then we'll talk about what's going on and why. So that was one of the very first vlogs that we made. It was silent. It was a kind of a collaborative project. The content was originated and produced by deaf individuals. Our art director and video editor were deaf. And so this was really a kind of bilingual film production project. We didn't even, it wasn't a kind of a terribly political choice at first to make the film silent. It was that, our producers were all deaf, and so that was really their preference. There was also a thought, oh, should we add voiceover, which would make these a more universally designed and accessible feature for people who are dependent on the audio component of film. And their preference really strongly was, I don't want someone else's voice to stand in for my own. And so we had a lot of conversations about this. We later introduced an audio description track that is optional for people who are blind or have low vision, or for other users who prefer to have audio. But it was a choice, and we thought if we're going to really stake a claim to co-create these, we can't then dictate what the preferences of this community that has often been marginalized, what those preferences are. So we really tried to take the lead from our collaborators. And the project kind of took off. We were surprised that anyone beyond our very small target population would be interested in watching short silent films about modern and contemporary art online. But we ended up making dozens of these. They were viewed online hundreds and thousands of times, and the project has been replicated at a number of institutions, not just here in New York and around the US, but also abroad in Brazil, in Amsterdam, and other, not that Amsterdam is a country, in the Netherlands. It really was surprising to us. And so here we have just an array of some of the kind of short videos that we made, stills from those, everything from gallery talks and tours to artist studio visits, going behind the scenes in the museum's conservation lab. It really gave us a platform to open the museum up and share a little bit of that behind the scenes gray matter. We disseminated these online. We didn't have a big budget for sharing the material. It was kind of mainstreamed with all of our audio and video content that we produce. But we did create tags that allowed people to kind of filter for these and summon them. And so there's a still of our website if you were to pull up a selection of these videos. But they also received kind of critical recognition in the field. So we won a few awards for these. We received a Jody Award for Accessible Digital Culture, Best of the Web Award from Museums in the Web, and a Bronze Muse Award. So not only did it take off as a kind of popular phenomenon, but it was also somewhat critically embraced. But I think we continued to question our assumptions. So we were really proud of the work we were doing in the deaf community. We had great tours happening in our galleries. We had outreach programs where we were partnered with local schools for the deaf. We were creating online video material that was traveling far and wide and opening the museum up. During the 2014 biennial, we had an artist named Joseph Gregory. His work was presented, and he is somebody who lost his hearing around the age of 10, and he communicates through a combination of speech, sign, reading and writing, and much of his work actually dealt with this, where he would collect all the little scraps of paper from people that he used to communicate, and those would comprise these kind of studies of communication. And we were delighted that Joseph was going to be at the Whitney and that we would be able to invite him to work with all of these programs and to star in vlogs. And when we approached him, his work for the 2014 biennial, was something called the Gregory Batcock Archive. It was not his work exploring communication. This is a gallery view of some archival cases where he was sharing kind of found documents that related to a kind of relatively somewhat unknown artist and critic who had passed away and who Joseph had encountered his archive and decided to curate it. But so we approached him, and he said he wanted nothing to do with our programs. He was very happy that they existed, but as an artist who was deaf, he did not want to be pigeonholed. He did not want, because his work in this context didn't deal with deafness, didn't deal with his communication experiences. It was really about something totally different. He didn't want it to be presented in the context. So it was interesting, those assumptions, right, about artists with and without disabilities and how they exist in cultural institutions and how they want to frame their identity, frame their experience for different publics was interesting to us. we have been trying to sustain the relationships that we built through this project. So this is a photo from the new Whitney from, I believe this is 2016. We hosted our first ASL Slam, and we had artists and signers from the New York City community and beyond. The auditorium was completely filled. It was, we had probably about 150 people in attendance, and creating original works of poetry, of theater, of kind of improvisation, monologues in American Sign Language that related to works of portraiture in the Whitney's collection. And so I'm showing a brief video from Instagram, which actually shows a little fragment of a performance inspired by Jared Bark's work. But this was really a signature kind of turning point for us, where we shifted from just using American Sign Language as a kind of means of transmission, right, as a way to put information out into a community that previously had been denied access, but rather now inviting that community at large into the museum and creating space for them to have creative authorship and really explore somewhat profound connections between visual art and visual language. How am I doing on time? I'm not really keeping track. Perfect, okay. So now I'm going to kind of jump ahead to the Andy Warhol Museum. So one shift that I personally have experienced, and here we have an image of the facade of the Andy Warhol Museum. I mentioned it's located in Pittsburgh, the front windows of the museum. It's a converted industrial building on the north side of Pittsburgh. It's 7 stories tall with an underground education center and conservation studio. But so one thing that shifted for me is that my role at the Whitney was very much defined as trying to enhance accessibility, provide technical assistance to the other curators on how to make their exhibitions more inclusive, developing programming that reached out to audiences, accommodations, and now really I've moved into being more of a generalist. I am concerned with the experiences of all of our audiences, including people with disabilities. So it makes a lot of sense for the Warhol to really embrace the notion of inclusive and universal design. And so here's a picture of Andy Warhol's Silver Factory in the mid-1960s. I believe this is 1964. And it's a black and white party scene where, in his kind of big loft with the silver tinfoil covered walls, where anything and everything went and anybody and everybody was welcome. It was a place where kind of high and low culture mixed and mingled, celebrities and socialites and drug addicts and drag queens hanging out together. And so that notion of everybody being welcome and really appreciating difference is something that we embrace as part of the culture at the Warhol. I have here a little portrait of Andy with his little beloved dachshund Archie, and a little quote. Warhol actually, despite the kind of public persona that he crafted, was somebody who knew what it was to be an other. He was a child of working class Carpatho-Rusyn immigrants in Depression-era Pittsburgh. He was openly gay at a time when homosexuality was criminalized in the United States. He struggled with illness as a child. And so, this was very much embedded in his personal experience. But so this quote, I always think about what it means to wear eyeglasses. Eyeglasses standardize everyone's vision to 20/20. That's an example of everyone becoming more alike. Everyone could be seeing at different levels if it weren't for glasses, right? So sort of in his kind of pithy way, right? Appreciating our natural differences, our natural abilities, and not that those things compromise us, but rather that they make us kind of unique and interesting and beautiful and bring a kind of multiple perspectives to our world. So universal design, just to quickly define that term, because I don't know if we already talked about it, is the design of products and built environments to be accessible to all, regardless of age, ability, or status in life. The phrase design implies that this is aesthetic. It is not purely about the function of welcoming diverse audiences, but it does anticipate a diverse user base. And there's a photograph of Ronald Mace, who is seated in a wheelchair. It's an old black and white photograph. He's a very kind of friendly-looking bearded man turning towards the camera in a suit. He was an architect, and he really coined this phrase and was sort of one of the fathers of this modern movement. But so I'm going to share very quickly a case study that we're working on currently at the Warhol. So this is sort of hot off the presses, or very much a work in progress. But we started to think about this notion that one of the audiences that experiences the greatest challenges in visiting an art museum, a visual art museum, are people who have visual impairments, right? And being able to have an immersive and engaging and independent experience, if you're somebody who's blind who comes through the doors of a museum, it can be challenging to provide that. It's often very labor intensive, right? Guiding, sort of facilitated experiences. For the Warhol, we continue to be a destination museum, right? As a single artist museum in a relatively small city, you can imagine nearly 3/4 of our audience are actually visitors who come through from out of town, right? Our tourists, many international. It's a place of pilgrimage. We are the kind of keepers of Warhol's most extensive collection and his personal archive. So people really travel from all over and to make this visit. And so we started to think about how can we design in our galleries for visually impaired users, knowing that most people who come aren't going to be able to schedule a tour, they're not going to be able to come to the once a month that we have a describer. And so we have an image here of just as we were starting out with this process, and you can see a member of our education staff, she's in our galleries, and a kind of older woman who is blind is seated on a little stool, her dog rests at her feet, and she's feeling a tiny 3D printed translation of a two-dimensional work by Andy Warhol of Marilyn Monroe, of course, and you can actually see a small 3 Marilyns, an early work where he was working with this iconic image in the background. But so we started experimenting with creating 3D replicas of originally two-dimensional works of art, so using a combination of digital imaging technologies, and we started out 3D printing, but anybody who's worked with 3D printing knows those can be a little small, they can be a little flimsy, sometimes that lightweight plastic material doesn't communicate the kind of weight and detail of a certain work. So we moved to using a computer numerical controlled router to actually etch into the surface of very durable materials. So now we're working in large scale on a material called acetal, which is actually harder than your cutting board at home. And it has antibacterial properties, so if many people come through the museum and rub their hands over its surface, it actually helps us in limiting the transmission of, just like handrails and things, transmission of germs and illness. So I have an image here both of a big CNC router as well as some hands touching one of our early prototypes of a 3D printed Warhol. I'm going to now skip to the next slide, which has some audio embedded, so it might start to play automatically. But I'm going to show what those oh wait,
this piece features a large bottle of Coca-Cola in an abstract setting, originally rendered in black crayon and black paint. The glass bottle stands alone on the left. Starting near the bottom, you can follow its curves up toward the narrow mouth near the upper left-hand corner of the piece. The brand's cursive logo is located halfway up the bottle, and a patch with the texture of polished concrete can be found at the top. We'll return to that patch in a moment. To the left of the bottle, covering the edge of the piece, are patches of rough lines, which represent the crayon markings found in the original work. Covering the right-hand side of the piece, parallel to the bottle.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to truncate that description. But so we decided to pair these large-scale permanent gallery installations that are kind of raised tactile surfaces with a guided audio experience so that anybody coming through the museum at any time could pick up a device and could have a combination of description, touching, and learning about the works of art in a really self-directed way. So we decided to use off-the-shelf, readily available access solutions rather than trying to reinvent the wheel ourselves. And so our experience lives on an iOS platform, on Apple devices. It's available free in the App Store if you want to check it out. But what this affords us is the ability to use really cutting-edge accessibility technology this is a great example of a universally designed product, but towards making our museum more inclusive. And so our app actually utilizes, it is location aware, so we have low energy Bluetooth beacons embedded in our galleries, which push out content to our visitors based on their location as they move through space. So it will actually notify you that you are near one of these tactile displays. Would you like to listen to a guided tactile narration that's going to walk you through kind of what you're feeling and what you're seeing? We also have visual descriptions for all of the objects in that are included in this tour. The content is dynamic, so it actually reorders. We have small chunks, kind of little stories, different voices talking about each work of art, and those reorder based on your preferences. The device is voiceover compatible and has enlargeable text and transcripts of all audio. So we really tried to create a guide that would work for everybody, but that was designed with visually impaired users in mind, right? And so in designing for the margins, we hope to really encompass a very broad audience here. So that's the Warhol Out Loud. The Warhol Out Loud is the name of the app. You can go and download it, as I said. And actually, there was a tremendous amount of user testing embedded in this process, right? So figuring out how to get this right and what features were going to work for our audience. We engaged members of the Pittsburgh community, local individuals who are blind or have low vision, who came in and worked with us again and again. Here are some photos, little outtakes from this process where we have, there's a man named Chris who's holding a white cane, standing with a companion in our galleries, and he's holding the app and kind of starting to navigate. We also have a woman seated, we're kind of looking over her shoulder. She's seated at a table using the app and telling us what she thinks of the content and the interface. And then finally, we were really pleased to start to premiere these. We kind of started to build these into our galleries during the LEAD conference last year, which was in Pittsburgh in August, and now we're actually rolling them out through all of our permanent collection display floors. They are popular not just with individuals who identify as having a visual disability, but rather all visitors, right? Everybody in the museum wants to touch. All kinds of people learn in different ways, and so having more options available for our public to explore has been really well received. And then finally, we are, this is a kind of iterative process, right? So we've already pointed out, this work is never done, right? This engagement, this welcome, it's not that you check that box, it's rather that you have opened up a kind of a pathway and a conversation that continues to unfold. And so I'm really delighted about these. It's a full-scale, three-dimensional Brillo box, interpreting one of Warhol's Brillo box sculptures from the early 1960s, and this is made using that same routing process, but actually assembling it, kind of constructing it much the way that Warhol would have. So there's another great Warhol quote that I'll share. I don't have it on the screen, but this notion that people always say time changes things, but sometimes you have to change them yourself. So I encourage us all as curators to think about the ways that we can change some of the status quo and really make our institutions more accessible and inclusive to people with and without disabilities.
Hi, everyone. Yeah. So thanks so much for the invitation and for your lovely presentations before me. So on the slide right now is the title of the panel, Access, Ableism, and Disability in Curatorial Practice, along with my name, Eliza Chandler, and my email address, eliza.chandler@ryerson.ca. Next slide. So I'm going to be speaking to you today, drawing on my experience as the former artistic director of Tangled Art Plus Disability, which is an art organization and gallery in Toronto, Canada, which is dedicated to both the cultivation of disability artist practices as well as the development of inclusive curatorial practice. And we take a lot from Amanda's work to think about how we make our work accessible, as well as to follow some universal design thinking really explicated in the Smithsonian Guideline for Accessible Museum Practices. And I have the resources up in a minute, but just to give a visual description of the slide, this is a photograph of the Tangled Art Gallery taken from outside of a glass accessible door. So you see an accessible door, you see the Tangled logo on the door, which is written in hot pink, Tangled Art Gallery with a loosely tangled hot pink thread. And beyond the accessible door, you see the gallery with highly painted wooden floors, rose-colored walls, and you see tapestries on the wall. Next slide, please. And here we have it again with the Tangled Art Gallery logo. Next slide, please. And some resources. Next slide, please. And I'm going to skip over some of the slides just in the interest of time. So this is really how I'm framing and I'm talking about. This is the position from which I sit as I talk. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, I think I had them a bit out of order. But this is an image of some sculptural work by Canadian disability artist Persimmon Blackbridge. On the slide, you see three human-like sculptural figures made out of human-made products and natural products. In the foreground, you see a large and sort of, for lack of a better word, or lack of a better scale, Barbie doll-sized scale, so quite small. And you see one of the images, which is a mahogany, a human form made out of mahogany. One of the human's arms is made of a feather, and one of the human's legs is made of a stick. And the whole figure is cut down the middle and held together by metal casters. So we were fortunate enough to open our gallery last April with this work by Blackbridge, which did significant work for the Tangled Art Gallery to profile sort of the best of Canadian disability art. And what was so, I liked to include this as an introduction into what disability art is, and we can take that up in the Q&A if there's interest. But Persimmon identified as a disability artist, but I don't think that her work necessarily represents explicitly the disabled body. Although it was fascinating to me how many times people would come into the gallery when we had the work on display and say to me, I've never before seen myself represented on the wall of a gallery. And it's quite striking. And these people, you know, obviously they didn't have a wing for an arm or a stick for a leg, but something about the aesthetic of the work, which I think about in how Persimmon has foregrounded difference and used that difference for its aesthetic possibilities as doing something that is relatable to other people who live with embodied difference. Can you go back? Yeah, that's perfect.
Wait, forward or back?
Back, yeah, thank you. So here on the slide, I'm just gonna read the top quote just in the interest of time. And the bottom is a bit small anyway. But Crip, this word Crip is a word that gets used a lot in disability studies, which is where I come from. And Crip is a reclaimed word similar to queer, Crip from cripple, and it can mean many things. The way that I want to use it in the context of this talk is following disability scholar and activist Kelly Fritsch, who uses crip as a verb. And she says, when we crip something, we open up with desire for the ways that disability disrupt. Next slide, please. And two more. Again. Yeah, we'll leave it here. So I use this idea to Crip a lot when I talk about accessible curatorial practices and programming disability art. Because when when we change our gallery practices with the interest of centering disabled people, not tolerating disabled people, not including when our regular cultural practices can go on as planned, but when we actually begin to disrupt some of the cultural practices, as you two were talking about, it is disruptive, and I think we need to recognize that disruption. So if my gallery is inaccessible, and I want to make it barrier-free, that's disruptive to my budget and even potentially to the facade of my gallery. If I program a disabled installation artist, and that installation artist requires 3 weeks to install their work because their body only allows them to work a few hours a day, that affects my programming schedule. It could mean that my gallery is dark for 3 weeks, which is quite unexpected. If I have relaxed gallery hours, which are gallery hours we do at Tangled, which make exhibits accessible to neurodiverse communities, including folks with epilepsy or folks who autistic people. And those are gallery hours where we purposely turn down any of the loud noises or bright lights or sort of abrupt features of the gallery and keep things soft and low key, and also invite people to roll around on the floor, interact with the art in the way that they do. That could be potentially very disruptive to how others who come into my gallery interpret that work or experience that work. But if we don't open up with desire to the ways that disability disrupt, then I think we're only making our galleries inclusive for a very specific type of disabled people. And I think as the ADA becomes more and more implemented into these cultural spaces, we will no longer have a choice of whether or not we make things accessible. We'll have to. Our choice becomes whether we open up with desire to this disruption and what can emerge. So on the screen are 2 pieces of tactile work, which is a common feature of accessibility, of accessible curatorial practices to allow people to experience the work through touch. I'll talk about the slide on the right, which is a sculpture by Blackbridge, as you've seen before. This is mounted on a wooden slab, and it's a sculpture much like the one we looked at before. A man, Sean, who works at the Tangled Gallery, is wearing a black and white shirt, and he's reaching out and touching the sculpture. At the time, we didn't know about the universal symbol for tactile work, which is a blue hand. So we just have on the gallery wall, this is a piece of tactile work, please touch, and Sean is touching it. And I'd like to use this as an example because it really foregrounds how the demand for accessibility can really improve artistic culture overall. So when I was curating for Simon's show, I talked to her and I said I would like for some of the work to be able to be touched. Is that okay with you? And she said, well, it isn't, because the work is very delicate. I don't want people to touch it. And that's a completely valid response. And when we make artwork accessible, it's not about bending it's not about creating boundaries, it's about creating possibilities. So we went back and forth, and I offered to do a 3D printed version of a sculpture in silicone, which would make it tactile. And Persimmon came back to me and said, how about this? How about I actually create a work of art that is tactile for the show? And so that's what we agreed on. So now my demand for accessibility actually created more art. So, I mean, that's sort of the best possible outcome. And I think in making this work, Persimmon described her process as typically looking at and unfinished work, and trying to judge visually if it was balanced, if the composition, how it was sort of promoting an aesthetics of difference. And in this work, Persimmon judged all of the same qualities using touch rather than sight. So actually the proper way to engage with this work, it wasn't through sight, it was through touch. And I think that tells us a lot about disability aesthetics. It's a new way of judging artwork, and it changed Persimmon's practice forever. She talks about how now she always judges things through touch as well as through sight. So next slide, please. And we'll just skip over, next slide, next slide, next slide. So on the screen now, I just wanted to give a little brief example. This is the atrium of the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is a beautiful wooden ramp that everyone uses to get into the gallery, and I think it really dismantles any beliefs that creating an accessible gallery would disrupt the aesthetics of the space. This really enhances the aesthetics. Next slide. I just skipped through here. Skip a little bit more. Okay, we'll end with this slide. Thank you. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about how I think making work accessible can really enhance the collaboration of the art and the art audience, and I really think that is true. As much as we do follow universal designs for curating, we also have to think about the very specific interaction between bodies of difference and art, which of course are, there's so many ways to make art. And to think about initiating that conversation between artist and curator, artist and about their work as being a role that a curator can play early on in the artist preparations for the show, to think about how to open up that conversation. How are you going to build the show as an accessible show from the ground up? What are you? How is that my demand going to change the aesthetics of your work? And here on the screen is an image from a show on now at the Tangle Gallery, and this is by Deirdre Logue, who's a feminist video artist in Toronto. And Deirdre's work is about her tactile way of experiencing the world. So Deirdre has videos of her sort of snapping and unsnapping a snap, or rubbing her feet across a cat stretcher toys, and her hugging a corduroy pillow and feeling what that feels like on her skin, chewing a balloon until it bursts, very tactile experiences. And so on the screen here is an installation shot of, in the foreground you see a large speaker, behind the speaker a light show, to the side of the speaker a bench in the gallery, and back beyond the speaker you see a pile of old television sets. So in thinking about how to facilitate this, to make this work accessible, I sat down with Deirdre and we talked about the work itself before talking about the access. And she told me the work itself is really about how I experience the world through tactile sensation. So we decided to pair her with another artist, David Bobier, who creates vibro-tactile technology, which is turning sound into motion. So I'm drawing on the sound waves and turning those into tactile vibrating sensations. So with Deirdre's work, we created what they called extension. So when you're watching the video of her hugging the corduroy pillow, you actually can pick up a corduroy pillow in the gallery that translated the sound in the video into motion, and you can feel what that sound feels like. And I think that really does extend her work. It makes the work more effective, and that's what we do when we open up, when we build access into our gallery. I had a few more notes on the aesthetics of disability art. I think I'll save those, but just to say that all of these access features, I think, do contribute to the aesthetics of the work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. We have about 15 minutes remaining, so I'd just like to open it up to the audience straight away for questions.
Thank you. Hi. Eliza, thank you so much for your presentation. I was hoping you actually could talk more about aesthetics of disability, because I feel like we have much more to learn.
That's great, and maybe I can take a stab, and I'd love to hear from any of you as well. So Deirdre's work, I think, is a good example, a good place to start. So she identifies as a queer disabled artist. So in her work, I think the queer aesthetics of her work comes through the intimacy and drawing us into the intimate acts of everyday life, making herself vulnerable, as well as being in control of that vulnerability through controlling how we see her in these intimate spaces. And I think what makes it disability art or Crip aesthetics is that focusing on the different ways that we interact with the world, and thinking about that as being something interesting and contributory to the aesthetics of the work. So when we use this word Crip as opening up with desire for the ways that disability disrupt, and we pair that with how Rancière talks about aesthetics as being something that is a personal determination of what is satiating in form, we can put these two things together and think about. I would just say two things, and then I'll pass it along. So one of the images that I had up, which I didn't talk about, was by artist Jess Sash, who puts their disabled queer, genderqueer body into the images of what we might think of as an American apparel aesthetic. And so you see their genderqueer disabled body wearing these American apparel clothes, but instead of sort of looking defeated, Jess is looking right at the audience. And this work was curated in Toronto metro stations on the LCD screens, and so it was public work. And I like to think of somebody on their morning commute, gazing up at the LCD screen, expecting to find a normatively beautiful, desirable model, and instead finding Jess. And for just a minute, or maybe more, being compelled by that difference as something that is aesthetically interesting or satiating. It's a personal determination, and how that might help us to change and to open up with desire for that disruption, to not only to not overlook it as something which prevents satiation. Another way of thinking about disability aesthetics might be how the body of disability disrupts art making. So if I make a video and I can't quite get the video and the sound to match up because of my unsteady hands, we could look at that as a piece of bad art, as a mistake, exclude that from our aesthetic understanding. we could think, oh, well, Eliza was just doing the best she could. Let's overlook that. Let's tolerate that difference. But instead, if we say that contributes to the aesthetic of the work, if instead we say, let's open up with desire to the way that her different body disrupts the art-making practice, we can understand that disruption as aesthetically pleasing rather than a mistake. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Francesca or Danielle, did you have comments about disability aesthetics? Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, I had a question. One of the ways that I've been wanting to, over here, expand an exhibition that we're going to be doing about Matisse is by creating a multi-sensory experience for the viewer, sort of lifting off these two-dimensional images through music. But the choices of music would be jazz, which is not to everyone's taste, and medieval chanson, those sung poems that he was illustrating. But how could I do that? What could I do to implement really thoughtful ways to create? You mentioned time periods where there's no sound, for example, or special signage. What can we do to be mindful and accommodate everyone that wouldn't necessarily want to hear those songs without going to headphones?
I would offer that, one of our goals in creating access and inclusive experiences is really providing choice to our visitors and agency in crafting the experience that best suits their needs and preferences, and those may shift day to day over time, whether you're visiting alone or in a group. But so that's something we think about. So often people who have functional limitations or disabilities, when they visit a cultural institution, there is like one thing for that. It's, oh, if you come back Tuesday, 3 weeks from now, we have a touch tour, it'll be great. Or it's, oh, okay, here's this guide in American Sign Language. But of course, these solutions, these approaches are not one size fits all. And so I think that, technology affords us a lot of opportunities for people to customize and craft their own experiences. But so do our choices as curators, right? In kind of determining the ways that people move through and interact with our experiences. So that's what I would offer, is that to the degree possible, and it might be introducing something like relaxed or sensory-friendly hours where, the sound and the lighting and things are adjusted to kind of alter the space and people can make those choices, or giving actual visitors in real time a little bit more control. That those might be approaches, but I also think that the approach has to suit, right, your unique institution and audience, and be reflective of that. So.
Okay, there's a question over there. I see a hand raised. Okay.
Hi, I work at one of these 19th century museums that was built in the 19th century, and it's this building that's, we are very aware, one of the least accessible buildings out there. And it has 2 additions that the architect decided, let's not have it level to any of the other additions before it. So we are aware that we have a really unfriendly building, but the cost to make it friendly is prohibitive to us right now. So what is it that institutions can do in a situation where they want to be more accessible, they recognize their inaccessibility? How do you address that with a public that is understandably frustrated with your institution?
Hello, is this on? Yeah. There are accommodations that can be made, at least to make the effort in the time being, I guess, until you're able to do the fundraising that's necessary to get to the place you want, where people can access the buildings. I'm thinking, for instance, locally of the Tenement Museum, where they have the same issue with stairs and not being able to access the different floors. And what they've done is a kind of descriptive tour on the main level, so that when people come in, they can sort of virtually at least, understand what is, on the other floors and experience it to a point, so.
Well, and I used my first professional role in accessibility was was overseeing access at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which almost seems like an oxymoronic title, but for this historically inaccessible building. But there were a lot of efforts that were made, from virtual tours to descriptive experiences to distance learning, where we could bring cameras in and kind of beam out experiences, to having handling objects. If a class group came and there were one student who used a wheelchair or crutches, and the rest of the tour was going to go climb up these tenement stairs, and that student was going to have to kind of stay behind. We had a whole program that was designed to happen in our accessible visitor center, and we would encourage some of the other students in the class to stay with that student so that he didn't have a totally isolated and different experience, but rather we tried to kind of meet some of the same learning goals in a different way, and that, over time they were able to make some headway with the physical access, but a lot of it was about thinking creatively about access to the content and to, everything from the ideas to the artifacts to the kind of emotional impact of the space itself.
Okay, there's a few more hands raised in the back there.
Are any of your institutions working with artists who are engaging the senses of taste and smell as the primary senses for their work, as a means of engaging many audiences?
Yes, that's a great question. We've just met a deaf artist who has a whole, I forget what she called it, but cabinet of curiosities with every scent imagined, like the scent from coffins, and I can't even list it out, but thinking about this exactly as you say, as a sort of a universal way of opening up how we might experience something, and she's really interesting when she talks about it. This is a universal way that we can, not everyone of course, but lots of people can experience something, an installation, but we do it in very different ways. So, and that sort of opens up an important conversation about art and how we all interpret art in very different ways, and how, as Amanda talks about, how when we offer things like visual description and things, we're not offering a direct translation of the work. We can't translate an audio experience or a visual experience into an audio one. We have to create something new. And I think by using scent as a primary way of engaging, we're sort of thinking about that. What I smell, as Chanel number 5 might smell like dung to somebody else, right? And that was an example from smelling these sort of small tubes. But nothing yet. It's in the ideation stage.
I just wanted to add on to that too. I've worked on several shows where I'm gravitating towards artists thinking about synesthesia. So that's also another avenue that you could explore it with your artists. Are there any other? I think we have time for one more question.
I really appreciate Eliza's comments about how these initiatives are really disruptive. And so I'm wondering, I work at a small city museum that collects both regional history and American art across the nation. And I'm kind of the primary driver for these issues, but I'm wondering about sustainability. I might not be there in 5 years. So I'm just curious about maybe are there resources or sort of practical ways to think about either infrastructure or fundraising or ways to kind of keep this moving forward rather than dying on the vine?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just a couple quick things in relation to my own practice. I mean, as art workers, we are transient. We do move from space to space, but implementing things like an equity and inclusion policy in your mandate is one thing that people have to be thinking about for years to come. And it really does come down to budget. I mean, we need to be thinking about how we budget for things radically differently. And it's an uncomfortable discussion to have because you don't want to bring it down to sort of a neoliberal model of who can we afford to include and who can't we. But if we begin to start including accessibility as a budget line in every program we have, then it's there. Then we have to fundraise more to meet our budget because our budget's bigger, but it will always be there, and people will always have to use that budget, fundraise for the budget, and use the budget.
I would add that at MoMA we have an accessibility task force, which is made up of representatives from across the institution. It's a very big group at this point, and everyone from the head of security to exhibition designers to AV, we're all there, and we're all looking at accessibility-related issues and how we can solve them. And so, as I said in my presentation, I think the key is that this is not one person's job. This is not the job of one department, but it's actually needs to be embedded across the institution. And for us to have the support of senior staff has really made a huge difference. I would say, invite them to your programs, get them to talk to people from the community that want more. I think that has sort of changed the philosophy of our institution.
I totally agree. I think these initiatives, these kind of transformations that happen within institutions, some of it is bottom up from really kind of passionate and concerned stakeholders, maybe who are on the ground level and doing this work and kind of pushing it forward. And then some of it also has to be kind of buy-in from the top. And I believe there is a process of kind of coalition building and creating kind of partnerships, friendships, alliances with people in different departments across the museum, and that can take the form of a task force or an advisory group, or simply inviting different stakeholders to participate in and experience these programs and see the benefits of really engaging new audiences and making the museum more inclusive. But also there is funding out there that is specifically related to access and inclusion. And sometimes as museums and cultural institutions, we're not even aware of those kind of channels because they fall outside our usual, the way we conceive of our work. But I think both internally and externally finding those people who share your kind of values and your vision and trying to work with them to build something more holistic.
And of course, these comments are all about sort of activating access points in your museum. What happens once you activate them, and then thinking about evaluating them and the effectiveness, and even if that's the language that you should be using, because we know that the audiences are diverse and their needs are diverse. So how do we evaluate that as well? And I know we've had some conversations, and I've had some challenges with, for instance, Eliza's work, where the piece that you had showed on the screen, where people could touch it. What happens in terms of people's behavior when they touch work? I've had some incidences where people aren't very respectful in terms of haptic activism. So that's a completely other conversation. I wish we had more time, but I would like to thank all three of you so very much for your contributions. And I'm sure they would be happy to answer your questions afterwards. So thanks very much once again.